welcome everyone. We are going to go ahead and get started. Hopefully we have a good number of people in here, and I'm going to introduce you to our presenters. This one is addressing wage equity and economic justice at all levels of our movement. So we'll be hearing from Merkeb and Layla. Merkeb uses she, her pronouns. Her career spans many years and over several continents. She has worked within many communities in various advocacy and management roles. In the United States, she has served those with disabilities, immigrants and refugees, survivors of DV, and human trafficking, and other community groups with a focus on social justice. Merkeb has vast experience working in developing countries with international nonprofit organizations, local governments, and faith-based organizations in areas of women and girls empowerment, grant management, HIV/AIDS prevention and intervention, and workforce training and development. And some of you, if you've been here with us all day today, you've met Layla. Layla uses she, her pronouns as well. Previously introduced to us, Layla is a program specialist with the Michigan Coalition to End Domestic and Sexual Violence and has been in the movement for 8 years with a focus in the Arab and Muslim community. So with that, if you have any questions during this time, please put those questions in the chat. In addition to that, closed captioning is provided. There is a link already placed in the chat if you need closed captioning. Just click the link and we will turn it over to Layla and Merkeb.
Thank you, Cherie. Like Cherie said, I am a program specialist at the Michigan Coalition to End Domestic and Sexual Violence. And prior to that, I was working at the Arab American or the Arab Community Center for Economic and Social Services, doing prevention work around domestic violence and sexual assault.
Thank you. I don't know that I want to add anything that Cherie said. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. It's a pleasure to share space with you, as well as with my co-facilitator in this conversation, Layla. Cherie, I know, is supporting us with the slides, so we're just gonna, I want to let you know these slides are nothing but images for us to be able to sort of look at if you are a visual learner. And a lot of what we're going to do is have an authentic and real conversation. So we want to share a little bit about the wonderful coalition that we work in. If you have attended our previous colleagues' workshop or breakout session, you learned that we really do work in an approach where we don't silo prevention and intervention, where it's important to see how each one of those types of work really is for survivors. It's to end violence, and it really supports the work that we do in general and as a whole. And at the coalition, we have a work group that you're gonna hear the name Umoja, and we want to explain just a little bit about what it is. When we, as the coalition, decided that intervention and prevention work cannot be siloed, neither can anti-oppression work. Anti-oppression work can't happen in silos. We cannot group identities and come together and approach an anti-oppression in our work. And so Umoja is a work group within the coalition that takes an intersectional approach to anti-oppression within our coalition and within our movement. And so when we say Umoja, that is who we're referring to. Umoja is a group within the coalition with a focus on anti-oppression through an intersectional lens.
Thank you, Merkeb.
Okay.
And I think you are familiar with this slide if you were in the session, in the last breakout session, around how we use the impact of intersectionality in our work. prevention work and in our intervention work. So basically, using this chart, we are looking at the whole of the survivor and all of their identities, and realizing that survivors can also hold privilege while experiencing oppression, as well as us being service providers or providing technical assistance to our member programs, that we can also hold privilege while experiencing oppression because of our identity. Did you want to add anything to that, Merkeb?
Yeah, so I want to thank you for that, Layla. I want to give credit to Dr. Crenshaw,
Yes.
which is really important. We're going to talk a little bit about the importance of giving credit to those that are doing the work. And so while Dr. Crenshaw coined this term for us to use in a social justice approach, certainly Dr. Crenshaw also shares that the idea of practicing intersectionality happened way before she coined the term for us to use, and continues to happen. However, one of the things that is really important for us as we talk about dismantling white supremacy and doing our work through an anti-oppression lens is really what I say, lifting this off the paper and making it our practice, making it part and parcel who we are. It has to be second nature in how we approach our work. It has to be the focus and a core tenet of how we do any of our work for survivors, because historically we know that many survivors are in the margins and the margins of the margins, right? And are invisibilized and are not served. And so the idea that the person comes with many identities and many lived experiences, and that informs how they interact with others, is really important and a core of what we believe and how we work at the coalition. So we're going to share a little bit about, I'm a much more slow-paced, really chill, laid-back kind of person. And so it's really hard to decide what are we going to talk about in the next hour, because we are doing a lot of work and so much. It's really important when we do get a platform to be able to lift the voices of those who often don't get a platform, to be able to highlight the work of those that have gone very much not accredited or not acknowledged. And so that was a tough thing for Layla and I to sort of agree on how are we going to sort of hone in on the things we want to talk to you about. But I think it's really important for us to start by saying that at the coalition, when we started our conversation around economic justice, it happened long before the funding was available for it. It was a core. So that's a thing I want to highlight, is that the funding makes the work a lot more reachable to more people, but at the core, the coalition started doing the work before a great deal of funding was put into work such as our economic justice work or greening work or other prevention sort of endeavors. And so it was really important for us to engage with one another and engage in the process ourselves before we could, or while we were also engaging our community, meaning we walk the walk and we talk the talk. And that was crucial. And I've been at the coalition almost 4 years, and I came into a culture where there was an expectation to be transparent. There is an expectation to be for others and for others to be for you. There is an expectation to have a level of vulnerability and authenticity in who you are and what you bring forth in terms of lived experience or work experience. And so our conversation started within the coalition around are we prepared and are we ready to move forth as we center anti-oppression as our work? What will that mean? What is the cost of that for those in the coalition and our membership and our community members? And can we do that work within ourselves first and see what that experience is and use those experiences to help support our communities? And so our conversation started with all those things, a level of transparency and empathy towards one another, being an allyship with one another and what that meant. But then the big piece, right, the accountability piece. So yes, we came in and we all said, yes, we're all willing. This is our culture. This is what we're truly going to do. But then what? What action steps are going to happen? And so the big piece became, in order for change to happen, we have to also be accountable to ourselves and to one another. And so part of Umoja's role is to hold our leadership accountable for the things that within the coalition, the changes that we know we need to make. So we want to just really highlight that change started within the coalition. The expectation of change is within the coalition before we can ask others to also change.
Yeah, I really appreciate that you are talking about that, Merkeb. When I think about how we start these conversations in our community, and this was prior to my employment at the coalition. I was a part of a agency that was a member program to the coalition, and we were part. My agency was part of the Delta funding. And we discussed this a lot as far as wage equity and economic justice, because this is what was one of our deliverables as far as the Delta grant, was to ensure paid family leave and what economic justice looked like for the clients that we were serving and for the community that we were serving. And it was important that we talked about, we need to reflect this within our own agency before we can ask our community to make these shifts, to make these changes also. So I'm really glad that we had you brought that up, Merkeb, and Umoja has been a way for us to ensure that our agency is being held accountable and our leadership is being held accountable. And even when I served as a board member with the coalition, and those are things that we talked about too, like when it came to the hiring practices within the coalition, looking at, those non-traditional like job requirements, as far as not so much are we going to look at someone's education every time we're looking for a new hire, or can we incorporate their lived experiences, their experiences within the movement, and those were essential conversations that we had to have, and how we can implement that into our policies when we were looking at new hires within the coalition. And prior to that, even when we were talking about wage equity and economic justice within the Delta program. And for example, at Access, we talked about even if we couldn't provide a direct policy of paid family leave, what were other things that the agency could implement that supported working mothers and working families? And that could be, what does our policy look like about bringing kids to work? And we looked at the coalition's policy around that, because the coalition has a great policy about bringing kids into work when you needed to, and things like that. So
Layla touched a little bit on the process, right? So the process within our coalition looked very different than it did perhaps in some of our community programs. And we want to be really authentic and transparent about that, right? Because within the coalition, we were able to have some common language, common understanding. We were able to have this experience together and a commitment and accountability from one another. Sometimes this process of even deciding to have the conversation can be challenging within, and Layla, I'm sure will touch a little bit about that, because it's a very nuanced conversation. Within the coalition, we are also really, we have a program called a domestic violence recovery loan program, in which the coalition was sort of, the program started before the coalition joined it, and it was a program that was led by a more academic research-based individuals in collaboration with a financial institution in our community. And the process of that, when that program was being established, really left out the voice of the survivor. It left out the voice of community and was designed in that way. And so a little bit later on, I'll kind of share around where we are with that program and some of the challenges that we faced and that we continue to face. So I really just want to take this time to really emphasize that the process of even starting this conversation is going to look very differently in our workplace, in our communities, in collaborations, because each community is unique in itself. And each one comes with those intersecting identities. Communities themselves come with their own identities. And so, I think Layla and I felt it was really important for us to say that this process is not always a smooth process. The process of talking about economic justice or wage or inequity in the economic justice sphere, it's not an easy process and will look differently for every community. And some of the big takeaways that we have learned is the importance of engaging those that are experiencing marginalization, the importance of engaging those that are, that this program is, or programs are designed for. And so we'll talk about that a little bit later, but if the takeaway for anybody is be patient with the process. Remember that you center the voices that are marginalized, the voices that are often erased, because those voices are important.
One point that I wanted to bring up that is part of that was part of the conversation was, I think for a lot of people doing this work in the movement, a lot of, Black and brown and people of color within the movement, I think that we need even to have these conversations amongst ourselves about, when we're asking for wage equity and economic justice for ourselves, because I think that we are always afraid to ask for what we think we deserve or a living wage, because I think especially in this movement there's this whole idea that like you do this work because you're passionate about it and you love it, not for the money, but we all have to live, right? And there's this whole idea about this martyrdom within this work, and I think that it can be really hard, especially with certain cultural norms where you don't discuss wages, you don't discuss money, and I think that we need to have those conversations first amongst ourselves and realize, yeah, we deserve to have a living wage, and I think that we need to have that conversation for ourselves as service providers, as well as talking about economic justice for the communities that we serve and the survivors that we serve.
Layla, do you want to start with sort of the highlights of the family leave?
Yeah, so one of the deliverables for Access, when I was part of Access, was the paid family leave, or supports for working families. And also Amanda Ezrush, who was way more involved in that than I was at Access. We had to collect the data within our own agency and our community on what the economic inequities that were present in our community. And I think that's important too, that our communities are all going to look different. And so you have to look at what's going to work in your community. And it was quite interesting and difficult to talk to businesses within our community about, what kind of paid family leave that they provided. And also we had to look at the makeup of our community. A lot of, especially young women in our community, immigrant women, those here who are here, undocumented, and what is their work life look like? Were they being paid under the table, and things like that? And so how could businesses in our community provide supports for working families? And that was a difficult conversation. It was a difficult conversation to have within our own agency, let alone out in the community. And that's when we looked at organizations like Mothering Justice, and what they were doing on the legislative side. And then also looking at the coalition, like I said earlier, about, could Access provide supports for working mothers as far as, bringing their child to work, mothers who were nursing. Was there a space within our agency that provided a physical space for nurses, or for mothers who were nursing? So we looked at those things.
Thank you.
Yeah, I was just looking at my notes to see if there was anything else.
Awesome. If there's anything else, actually. So some of the other inequities we wanted to kind of touch on that we saw. So Layla shared a lot about the family leave. Within our coalition, when we started that conversation around some of our own processes and some of our own policies, our research sort of led us to see that within our movement, and also within many nonprofits and within many social justice movements, what was very common was seeing that BIPOC, so Black, Indigenous, people of color, advocates entered our field in the very entry-level positions, which traditionally have been lower paying, sometimes minimum wage, very rarely living wages. And there's a difference. So I encourage you to sort of look into the difference if you're not aware. And so there were many barriers to that many BIPOC advocates identified. For example, in our field, a lot of ways to become a paid advocate starts with volunteer opportunities. Many BIPOC advocates expressed that even volunteer opportunities were not available to them in the same way that they were available to white counterparts. We found that burnout rates and microaggressions and racism and other bias and prejudice were present, which sort of made it so that BIPOC advocates would leave our field very quicker than their white counterparts or our white counterparts would. Then you see a swath of BIPOC advocates in middle management sort of positions, in supervisor and coordinator positions. And we see long longevity in there without movement to executive leadership or with more leadership making ability. And from these advocates, a lot of what we hear is that there's a lot of isolation in those positions. There's a lot of tokenizing in those positions. There's a lot of burnout, right? There's not a lot of opportunity for professional development. And then we see a very small amount of executive leadership or director positions that have ultimate maybe decision-making of BIPOC folks. And so this sort of pattern is repeated over and over and over again in many, many nonprofits and social justice movements, including our own movement. And so what we said within the coalition is we named it what it was. This thing is true. This inequity is happening in our movement. And we were honest and open about it. And so in that realm, we were able to sort of look at the inequity. In our DVRL program, the inequity laid in where we saw that the expectations, creditworthiness, sort of traditional creditworthiness was being applied to survivors, right? And there's inequity in that because we know that creditworthiness is being determined by very much a white supremacist sort of way. It is run by years and years of in our economic fields, especially in our financial institutions. Historically, we see, practices like redlining, which is where policymakers also become lenders and sort of decided what area was not worthy of investing, and Black folks were the only folks that were able to buy those properties, right? But this didn't mean that others were not able to heavily invest in those areas and then be predatory renters. And so we see these historical sort of bases for our lending practices today. And we see timelines, of urban decay and in the 60s and 70s, a timeline of mass incarceration in the 80s and 90s. And there was a foreclosure crisis in the 2000s and gentrification today. And now these pandemics. And so all of this has prevented, particularly African-American communities, from building generational wealth. And so these things now impact our conversations with these financial institutions that are supporting a domestic violence recovery loan. How we work with our domestic violence recovery loan impacts our Delta project that's looking at predatory payday lending in our Detroit areas. So when we say we can't silo this work, it's all connected. There is no way that we cannot work with one another for the benefit of survivors. And so this sort of brings us to the changes that we made, particularly in looking at changes we made within the coalition, changes that were made within Access, and changes that were made for our DVRL loan program.
Thank you, Merkeb. Before you go on,
Yes.
you have approximately 15 minutes left. And I just want to note that you have some conversation going in the chat.
Okay.
So this is at Layla. Absolutely. So many of us are working with survivors and understand financial abuse. but we aren't paid enough to make it possible for us to leave unhealthy relationships ourselves. There's a presumption in social work, et cetera, that we are all someone's wife and we don't really need to be paid a living wage, that our husband's salary pays the bills. And then so many times advocates are so great at providing resources and navigating economic assistance systems because we use them ourselves. And then a shout out, every nonprofit seeking to empower women with workers based in the San Francisco Bay Area or New York City and paying women $40K a year to empower them. Yikes.
Yeah, that's the truth.
It definitely is.
The inequity in compensation is just, it is the truth. It's a reality.
And I just think it's, it's so unfortunate that like we are still having these types of conversations and we're still working so hard to make these shifts and these changes when so many social justice movements, including this movement, was started by women of color and by BIPOC folks. So it's just so unfortunate that like really our movements have been pretty much hijacked by white supremacy culture, because so many of our systems here in the United States are based off of that white supremacy culture. Like Merkeb said, the redlining, gerrymandering, all of those things that innately have are intertwined with white supremacy are the systems that we have to navigate and our survivors have to navigate.
So we had I know we have 15 minutes. So we want to talk a little bit about some of the changes or where we are in some of these things. So I want to quickly highlight, and this is in no way are we able to talk about all the changes that happened, but quickly highlight. So within the coalition, we were able to make some policy changes around hiring and compensation rubrics. As Layla mentioned earlier, we literally, our leadership was fearless in looking at how do we create a rubric so that lived experience, work experience, identity can weigh just as much as an academic degree? And how can we look at engagement within community? Many communities just innately and inherently understand what it's like to work in community, to organize communities. And what does that mean when that is translated to a compensation or hiring rubric? And so we were able to do that. We have open and honest conversations about economic justice. There's a big stigma about talking about money, about compensation. I think this is the first workplace where my supervisor actually taught me how to negotiate my salary and encouraged me, shout out if she's in here, and encourages me to negotiate. And so those open and honest conversations, we recently looked at paid time off for part-time and quarter-time employees for an economic justice reason, because the world as it is today makes it so that folks have to choose between making a living or being safe. And so that should never be a choice folks have to make. Layla talked about children and others in the workplace. And we're recently talking about retirement. What does that look like? Or future planning. These are open and honest conversations. So these are just to highlight some of the conversations we had within our own organization. Conversations we're having with folks who are supporting our domestic and violence recovery loan looks a little bit different. What we quickly discovered is because some survivors in other communities were not there in the initial planning and creation of this program, we've reached a stage where a lot of emphasis is being put on credit worthiness. A lot of emphasis is being put on budgeting sort of to negate the idea that poverty exists, as though we erase poverty with the creation of a budget. And so where we are is we have started to build other relationships within community, within an economic empowerment center, and with an organization that employs folks with disabilities, so that they too are involved in this conversation as we sort of re-look at what does this recovery loan program look like. We're also working with colleagues who are doing work through our prevention program in identifying predatory payday lending practices in Detroit. And so together, to be able to sort of create an intervention program for survivors, while also supporting through information sharing as well as decision-making powers with our prevention folks. Layla, just a little bit maybe about changes that were maybe, or conversations of changes that were happening in Access?
Well, I know with Access, you know, that conversation was really, to even start that conversation was really difficult. And I was not, I wasn't there to kind of see the process go through. But I know that it was very difficult because we had to make policies and things that we were seeing, like from the coalition and from Mothering Justice. We had to make it work for our community and our organization, being a serving mostly within the Arab American community, and most of the employees that were at Access were identified as Arab or Arab American. So we had to take in those cultural things, and there's certain cultural aspects about talking about money that just doesn't happen or happens in a different way. So we had to be really cognizant of that. But it was really interesting because somewhat of like between 80 and 90% of the employees at Access were women, and women of color. And so there had to be a lot of discussions on how, if Access could not implement a paid family leave that was monetary compensation, what else could that look like? And as I stated before, we looked at the coalition's policy around bringing children to work. And I think even, you know, there was a time where I was working with the coalition around this. This is way earlier, before it even became like a deliverable for our funding, for our grant. I advocated for myself to be able to bring my child into work with me, at least the first year that I was, you know, back from maternity leave. And I don't think if I was working with the coalition that I would have known to have advocated for myself for that. So that was like one of the things. And also what I wanted to know, when I was on the board with the coalition and we were talking about the hiring rubric, I think one of the things that was really important part of that conversation was that we couldn't be, we had to create, we wanted to create this rubric that that had the, you know, looking at someone's lived experiences, work experiences, being part of a community of color, and identifying as a person of community color without the tokenism that I think sometimes happens when when folks are hiring within our movement to serve a certain community or to serve a certain purpose, that tokenism piece was not going to happen. And what I also, something that Umoja recently has been a part of is you know, our leadership did a really awesome, great thing about, you know, making sure that there was someone from Umoja present during the hiring process. And if there was no, and if that couldn't happen, what were other ways that that Umoja could still hold our leadership accountable when they were doing the hiring process?
Layla. And so there is a note I want to just acknowledge
Yeah.
that, and that's an awesome thing, that it's a great example, right, of why rooting our work through an intersectional lens is important. So in many cultures and religions, including for members of our coalition and those that may want to access the DVRL loan, receiving interest on any money may be something that they're not able to do. So instead of saying, well, then you cannot invest in our 401k, or you are not able to get this loan because it does accrue interest, it's how do we build some of these, first, how do we have these conversations with community partners so they understand, and then how do we change or adjust or add to these programs so that no one is excluded from receiving these services. And so no one in our workplace feels excluded of maybe contributing to their 401k. And for the DVRL, this came with, you know, being able to, for funds raised, being able to sort of cushion that and make sure that the person is not receiving the interest of any loans or paying interests of the loans. So more fundraising was done so that interests could be paid. And within the coalition was a conversation within our leadership, policy and human resources of what happens if someone doesn't want accrued interest, and what are alternative ways. So we have a few minutes, and you just want to say that our contact information is on the screen. You know, we all know we are living in a society, in cities and places within policies that are just they're structurally designed to be racist and inequitable. And so we have to do the work as though it has never been done before, the work like we have never done before to undo these things. We have so many things to conquer, and I think it's really important to continue to remember to give a platform and give space for those marginalized and invisible voices, to remember that our work is not siloed, to remember we are not competing, as we said earlier, and that using an intersectional lens is an important lens in how we do our work and our approach to survivors.
Thank you, Merkeb and Layla. There's a question in the chat for you. What would a smorgasbord of benefits look like that would be more culturally relevant? And I know you only have a few minutes.
Yeah. So I want to say that culturally relevant, that's a very broad scope thing, right? So everybody has those layered identities, right? So Layla and I might both identify with similar identities, but that the relevancy of those things might be different to each of us. At the coalition, we look at administrative leave, we look at both salary-based and non-salary-based benefits. Professional development, I think, is a benefit that we really emphasize, not just on paper, but actually money towards the professional development of me as a Black woman, as part of a benefit of me working at the coalition. So Deborah, I'm happy to share some of what these benefits look like at the coalition, including talking about that rubric if you'd like. I know we only have a few minutes. Layla, I don't know if...
I was just gonna say that, you know, I don't think that there's like you know, there's nothing that there is, we can provide what we know, but you have to be prepared, or you have to be really willing to constantly learn and adapt, because I'm sure there's things that I know that there's things that we are missing within our coalition that we can be more intersectional around. We can be ways that we can work to dismantle white supremacy. Like, I know that there's still things that we are missing. And I think that if you open these conversations up to your agency and your employees, that it's constantly needs to constantly change. So
Thank you all.